Hi there, BookTube. It's Roz, and it's early July. No, nearly mid-July. So definitely time to do a mid-year review kind of video. And usually, the last couple of years, I've used the mid-year freak-out book tag to do that. And don't attack me, little kitten. And this year, I'm kind of, yes, I'm going to still use it, but manipulate it a little to suit my ends. So I have read, up until the end of June, 84 books in 2024. So I've got lots to choose from. I take a very literal view of what the mid-year is, and I'm only going to talk about things that I read up to the 30th of June. So literally middle of the year. Now, first prompt is to say your best book of the year. And so I'm going to cheat a bit or change this a bit, because I'm going to start the video by telling you my best to, or most interesting to non-fiction read of the year, and my favourite reread of the year. And then right at the end of the video, I'm going to give you 5 new contemporary novels that have particularly impressed me and engaged me. So, and then a load of other stuff in between. So let's start with those 2 non-fiction, wonderful books of non-fiction that really kind of stimulated my mind and my emotions. And one of those was Thunderclap by Laura Cummings. And that's kind of an overview of 17th century Dutch art combined with a memoir about her interest in art and her relationship with her father, who was an artist too. You know, there's so much in that book, and it particularly homes in on the life of Fabricius, who, you know, an individual artist. But it's really, yes, rich and interesting. The other was in its own way equally rich and interesting, but very different, and that's A Flat Place by Noreen Masud, and that's it's more strongly a memoir, but it's also kind of like a travel book. It's about landscape and nature and history. I mean, so much comes into it, but the heart of the book is how visiting some of the most beautiful flat places in the UK has been part of Masud coming to terms with understanding and starting to recover from a kind of complex PTSD from childhood experiences. There we go. Now, my favourite reread of 2024 so far was The Last September by Elizabeth Bowen. It's a book from the 1920s. Wonderful book. Do read it. About the sort of decline of the Anglo-Irish in Ireland. It's one of the relatively few rereads that I've done so far this year, and that's because the second half of the year always has more rereads for me because of Jane Austen, July and Victober, and now our last year, for the first time, we did Remember December, a December rereadathon, and when packed in a load of extra rereading. So expect more rereads in months to come, and in my end of year wrap up. Now, second question in the tag is the best sequel that you've read. And it kind of assumes that you read lots of series and sequels. Well, I don't. But one of my favourite books of the last month or two was a sequel, but it's just I hadn't read the book that it was a sequel to. That's a long-winded way of saying it again. Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange. I suppose perhaps one might describe it as a companion piece to his first novel. And you could probably read them in either order and it wouldn't really matter. But I definitely will go back and read the other, because it's such a fine book about kind of Native American experience of, well, the impact of kind of colonial takeover of and the sort of writing out of so much of their sort of culture and language and so on. Well, yeah, definitely want to read. I read another sort of sequel that was a sort of backlist book, and that was Singapore Grip by J.G. Farrell, which is the third in his trilogy, his Empire trilogy, about, you know, books he wrote in sort of like the 1970s about the aftermath, all about the British Empire. I suppose, and its impact and aftermath, but they're not a sequence. I mean, they're a sequence of books, but they're not a series. You know, you could read them in any order, I suppose, is what I would say. But I had a lovely time reading that with Priscilla, the evening reader, and Sarah of Roadworthy. But happily, I did read one bona fide, real, proper sequel this year in the first 6 months of this year, and it was a good one, and that was The Women of Troy by Pat Barker, which is the sequel to her book The Silence of the Girls, and there's a retelling of the Trojan War story. I read it together as a buddy read with Berna of Berna's Bookish Adventures. We both loved it, and it was both a lovely book and a lovely buddy reading experience. Now, another of the standard prompts in the tag is new releases that you've not read yet but want to, and it assumes that's new releases in 2020 in the current year, in 2024. I've still got a batch from 2023 that I really want to read and I haven't got to, despite having read 84 books. And one of those is The Apple in the Dark by Clarice Lispector. So, a new Benjamin Moser translation came out of a Lispector novel in October in English, and I haven't read it yet. It's shocking. I will. Another that I'd like to get to is Small Joys by Elvin James Mensah. He's a sort of a South London writer, so that really, is something that I connect with, I suppose. I'm sure I will get to it. I will. Two that I also absolutely want to get to that are from 2024 rather than 2023 are My Friends by Hisham Matar. And I've read one of his books before, and this one's it's got such, rave reviews from people I trust. And another is very newly out, and that's now it's The Lost Love Songs. The Lost Love Songs of Boysie Singh. Yeah, long title, by Ingrid Persaud. And I loved Love After Love, her first novel. So been looking forward to that one and hope to read that soon. Next question is your most anticipated releases still to come in 2024. And that's more straightforward for me because one of them is the third part of the Pat Barker trilogy. So having read in January number 2, I'm really looking forward to reading number 3, and we'll buddy read that with Berna again. And that's, what's it called? Let's get this. The Voyage Home. There we go. Because it's after the war is won and what happens next to those Trojan women, and can't wait. The other though is something I'm very excited about because it's released later this week, and that's Katie's book, The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, by Katie of Books and Things, and can't wait to get my hands on that, and I should be reading that soon. So now the next official question on the tag is your biggest disappointment of the year so far. Now, I don't want to dwell on disappointments in books, and I haven't had too many, but if you watched my video about the books I read for the BookTube Prize Octafinal, you will know that The Bee Sting by Paul Murray did not live up to my expectations, shall we say. I will say no more. The next prompt is the biggest surprise of the year, bookish surprise, and that also came from something that I read for the BookTube Prize up to finals, and that was Loved and Missed by Susie Boyt, and that is a novel that had passed me by when it came out. I don't know why. It was British novel from 2023. I must have read reviews of it, but somehow, I didn't spot it. And I'm so pleased to have read that novel. It's just very moving, thoughtful book about complex family relationships, mothers, daughters, grandmothers, and how we might have good intentions and mess things up. And it was a very, thoughtful and moving book that I'm very glad to have read. Thank you, Robert, for organising the BookTube Prize and making me have these happy discoveries that I might have missed. It might also have fitted the bill for the next question in the tag, which is a book that made you cry. Or in fact, I don't think it is the next question, but it's following on in my head. And because it did. And I don't cry a lot at books. And there's a couple of other books that have kind of brought a tear to my eye this year. One was a book of poetry, and that was Home Child by Liz Berry. And it's kind of inspired by the true story of her great aunt. Get in trouble down here. He's trying to. I'll have to stop gesticulating because he's determined to catch my moving fingers. Yeah. So Liz Berry, yes, her great aunt was one of the children that were sent from orphanages and children's homes in the UK to Canada and kind of like farmed out almost as almost slave labour. And a beautiful book of poetry. And, it's not often that a book of poetry, would a collection of poetry would bring a tear to my eye, but that did. The other, though, the novel that was perhaps the most intense emotional and distressing emotional experience of the year so far, amongst a number of kind of very, moving books that I've read, was Human Acts by Han Kang. Now, I buddy read this with Ian Powell, who's a wonderful commenter, and it's about sort of pro-democracy protests in South Korea in the 1980s and how those were brutally suppressed. Sort of that thing of like young people and hope and good intentions and then, utter awfulness, torture and death. Definitely, but done in a way that was really I found very moving. So there we go. Now, obviously, following on from that, you have to talk about a book that made you happy. And one thing that made me happy in this 6 months was getting to the end of the Canterbury Tales, not because I was, glad to be rid of it, but more because the sense of wonderful satisfaction I got from finishing reading, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in the original Middle English, and alongside the lovely, lovely Joe, or Tout-à-l'Étrec, as he's also known. But two books that definitely, I would say, made me happy, made me feel hopeful and optimistic, a sense of, hope in the face of some of life's challenges, I suppose, were two memoirs. And one of those was Welcome to St. Hell by Lewis Hancox. And the sort of subtitle for that is My Trans-Teen Misadventure. So it's a graphic memoir about growing up in St Helens in the northeast of England as a trans man, or would-be trans man, as it were. Lovely. And kind of just that sense of tough times and positive outcomes, I suppose. That's why it was a book that made me happy. The other was Strong Female Character by Fern Brady, which is a tough read and has a lot of sadness in it, because it's about growing up and young adulthood as a autistic woman who doesn't get a diagnosis. It isn't known that that's what's going on for her, and she's causes kind of multiple problems and enormous mental distress for her. But yet it did make me happy as a book because she's writing it very honestly, but with a sense of things have moved on for her. She is now able to celebrate her neurodivergence and find ways of working through the aspects of it that cause her have caused her some difficulties and challenges in her life. So an optimistic book, ultimately, I thought. Going back to doing the tag kind of in order, I'll be back to prompt number 7, and that's your favourite new author. Now, this question, I think, presumes that you will talk about an author that you read for the first time in those 6 months, and that, was an instant favourite with you. Now, there's a couple of people that I could perhaps pick out for that. Favourite author that was brand new to me, I suppose. Isabella Hamad, who wrote Enter Ghost. Wonderful book, which I can't say too much of because it's now in my BookTube Prize semi-final group. But I enthused about it earlier in the year. Definitely one of my books of the year so far. Another would be Alba de Cespedes. Her book, The Forbidden Notebook, I read in June. So the end of the 6 months, and it's a backlist book, but the first time it's been translated into English, and wonderful. I will definitely read more by both of those authors. But to really count as a favourite author, I feel I have to have read at least 2 books by an author and enjoyed both of them, and felt they were both works of that meet my criteria for what is a good book. And hence I can count that as a favourite author. Okay, and there are 2 that I've read a second book by in this 6 months that sort of matched up to the first book I've read and qualifies them for new favourite author status. And one of those is Lauren Groff, because I read Matrix a couple of years ago, and this year I read The Vaster Wilds, again thanks to the BookTube Prize, kind of pushed me into that, and both a kind of unusual type of historical fiction but there's something about the verve of her writing that really appeals to me. The other new favourite, and perhaps the strongest new favourite author of mine, I would say, is Selva Almada, Argentinian writer. I read Brickmakers a couple of years ago, was blown away by that. And when I came to read Not a River, which is her sort of most recently released in English, translated by, who's her translator? Annie McDermott, brilliant translator. Newly out this year. I thought, could it possibly live up to Brickmakers? And it absolutely did. If anything, I liked it even better. I will read the other book it's loosely a trilogy about masculinity, but they're all completely unconnected. But I will read the other one in that sort of set of 3 and more by Almada. Wonderful author. Really distinctive, cool style that's she writes about intense things in a unmelodramatic way, which is something I like. Well, now, problem number 8 in the tag is your favourite fictional crush, which never isn't a question that does it for me, I suppose. But what I would like to talk about is a kind of a particular new pleasure, bookish pleasure that I've had this year. Not a crush, but I have read, I've been learning over the last couple of years to really enjoy audiobooks more. And one thing that's happened this year is I've read more audiobooks that are narrated by the author. And I always think that's a risky thing, but about 3 of them this year have really paid off successfully. One was Breeding Sweetgrass, read by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And another, also non-fiction as it happens, was The Wife of Bath biography by Marion Turner. There's something about feeling the author's enthusiasm for their subject when you have non-fiction read by the author. Sometimes authors reading their own fiction doesn't work. Although I did have a success this year with a book of poetry, Poems by Len Penny, and sometimes she sort of tipped over into sort of bringing almost too much of her own emotion to the reading, but generally that was a magic experience to have read aloud to me by the author. The next prompt, number 9, is your favourite character of the year so far. Now again, this is one I kind of always struggle with a little. I don't tend to have kind of exactly favourite characters, or I mean, I enjoy characters in books, I don't mean that, but it's not, I don't come away from a book thinking, oh, that's one of my favourite characters. But what I will say is that this year I've had a kind of positive experience about a type of character that I often don't particularly enjoy or slightly mistrust, and that is the child protagonist, the child narrator, or the child main character. And I always feel, when I hear that that's what's in a book, it's like I reel back a bit and think, oh, I'm not sure about this. But I've had some real wins this year. One was Eugene in Happiness Falls by Angie Kim. He's a sort of a young man who doesn't use spoken language. He's not nonverbal. There's a difference, but that's really key to the plot of the book, which I tremendously enjoyed. Read very early in the year. Another was touched my heart. Gopi in Western Lane by Chetna Maru. So recently bereaved young girl, not preteen, not quite teenage, and her squash. She plays squash. Her relationship with her father, friends, sisters. Really, totally worked as a child narrator, unusually for me. And then a revelation this year was the child characters that Elizabeth Bowen puts in many of her novels and short stories, and some absolutely really convincing kind of odd children, but that bring a kind of different perspective to the story. Best example would be Henrietta in The House in Paris, but several. So that was a positive experience for me, if not exactly favourite characters. Then prompt number it might be number 12, because I slipped 10, 11 in earlier, didn't I? Is the most beautiful book that you've read this year, as in physically beautiful, and that has to be this one, Blossom Eyes by Simon Armitage. Lovely poems as ever, because Simon Armitage is one of my poetry gods. But look at what gorgeous cover. And then all the way through, it's a book about blossom, blossom in spring, and it's just full of the most beautiful illustrations that are an absolute joy all the way through. And I think I'm not that bothered by how books look as a rule. I'm all about the words and not about the imagery or whatever, not about illustrations, but that was just a little gem. So that brings me to the last non-prompt, my own self-imposed one, which is to give you 5 new novels that have really, really excited me in the first half of this year. Now, I've put some parameters on this, because I've said they've all got to be new, like from sort of 2022, 23, 24. They've all got to be ones I haven't already mentioned in this video so far, and not ones that I'm currently reading for the BookTube Prize semi-final, so, can't talk about. So, let's go. Oh, and these are not in ascending or descending order. They're just 5 wonders. Okay. One was, which I read at the very beginning of the year and still has stuck so much in mind, is The Night Alphabet by Joel Taylor. I love her poetry. And, you always hope when you love a poet that if they write a novel, you'll love it too. And this one was magic. It's feminist. It's kind of fantasy with an almost time travel-y sort of element. It's like a sequence of short stories, but they are truly connected, not just vague connection, they really are, as becomes clear as the novel proceeds. I have every confidence that at the end of the year it will still be one of my top books of the year. A second was Soldier Sailor by Claire Kilroy. The most intense and kind of brutally honest and yet wonderful novels I've ever read about new motherhood and the first year that you spend with your first child. Yes, what a stunner. Yes, I almost, it almost defeats my language to explain what an intense reading experience that one was. A third is a very different book that is kind of about motherhood and non-motherhood, I suppose, and relationships between adults and children, and that was Stillborn by Guadalupe Natal. I've forgotten the name of the translator. She's a Mexican author, translated from Spanish. Natasha Vima. I'll put it in the notes. A quiet book that somehow just sucked me in, and I was entranced by it. And books where you almost can't put your finger on what it is about a book that is so good, and yet it is. That was Stillborn for me. Then a more sort of obvious wonderful book, I suppose, and has had ample recognition for that, was Brotherless Nights by V.V. Ganeshananthan. Sri Lankan Civil War, really strong kind of female narrator, full of ideas, I suppose, about how do you bear witness to the impact of civil war on a country and on a people, and what choices might you make as a young woman living in civil war? Where will you choose to give your allegiance or otherwise? Yeah, tremendous book, worthy winner of the Women's Prize for Fiction. And then my fifth novel that really excited me was the least novelish of the five, and that was one that I read in June, so it's really fresh, but it's not just recency bias, I don't think. And that was After Sappho by Selby Wynne Schwartz. How to describe this? It's billed as a novel, but it's almost like a group biography in fragments of a whole sort of posse of fascinating, artistic, creative, queer women from the very beginning of the 20th century. And yes, I just enthused about it so much in my June wrap-up that I won't kind of go on about it again here. But it's a sort of, I suppose it's an experimental book that is, it would be a Marmite book without a doubt, but brought me both intellectual stimulation, loved the style of the writing, the language, and taught me things I didn't know, which is something I like in a book, even in a novel. There we go. So that's my magic 6 months, the best of my reading, and I hope you've had a brilliant half year so far, and roll on the second half and another 80 odd wonderful books, I hope.